August 1945. A new sun rose over Japan, but it was not the dawn of a new day. It was the birth of something monstrous, a light so bright it blinded the heavens themselves. In one single instant, cities that had stood for centuries were erased. Men, women, and children vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their shadows burned into stone. The survivors staggered through ruins that looked less like Earth and more like the wastelands of another planet. Their skin melted, their voices gone, their eyes staring into nothingness. And yet, this was not an earthquake, not a plague, not even the wrath of the gods. This was man's own hand. For the first time in history, humanity had split the atom, and in doing so, split its own soul. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not only cities destroyed, they were warnings etched in fire, proof that civilization had created a weapon capable of ending itself. Politicians would call it victory, generals would call it necessity. But for those who walked among the ashes, it was the end of the world, the end of innocence, the end of the belief that human beings could ever again wage war without risking their own extinction. This is the full chronicle of that apocalypse. The days when two cities burned, and the world discovered that its future now hung by a single thread of fire and silence. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The story of how humanity first looked into the abyss and saw itself staring back. The story of the atomic age begins not with an explosion, but with silence. It begins in a laboratory in Germany in the year 1938. Two chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, were studying the strange world of the atom. They placed uranium under the fire of tiny, invisible bullets called neutrons, expecting to see small changes. Instead, they found something shocking. The uranium had split in two. No one had ever seen such a thing, a heavy atom, broken apart. Out of that split came fragments, and with the fragments came energy. Far more energy than anyone had thought possible. It was as if someone had cracked a stone and discovered the heat of the sun inside. Far away, a physicist named Lise Meitner, who had escaped Nazi Germany, read the report. Walking in the snowy woods of Sweden, she worked through the problem with her nephew. And there, in the cold air, she saw the truth. This was nuclear fission, the splitting of the atom's heart. The numbers told her what it meant. A piece of matter no larger than a coin could release the energy of thousands of tons of TNT. A fire without limit had been discovered. At first, this discovery was only whispered about in scientific circles, but among those who understood, fear quickly followed. For the world was already sliding into war. Hitler's armies were growing. If Germany learned to use this discovery first, no one could stop them. So in the summer of 1939, a group of scientists decided to act. They wrote a letter warning that uranium could be turned into a bomb more powerful than anything ever built. The letter was signed by Albert Einstein and delivered to the White House. President Franklin Roosevelt read it, and though he did not yet fully understand, he gave the order to explore the possibility. That small decision would grow into the largest secret project in history. It began with questions: how do you split uranium? How do you gather enough of the rare fuel that makes the reaction possible? Most uranium in the ground was useless. Only a tiny part, uranium-235, could unleash the chain reaction. To separate it from the common kind was like searching for a single drop of dye in a lake. Scientists imagined enormous machines to do this work. Gas flowing through endless pipes, magnets pulling atoms apart, filters separating the rare from the common. At the same time, another path opened. A new element, never seen on Earth before, was created in laboratories: plutonium. Unlike uranium, it did not need to be mined. It could be made inside special reactors, where uranium fuel was bombarded until it transformed. Plutonium was unstable, dangerous, but incredibly powerful. It offered another road to the bomb. With these two paths, uranium and plutonium, the project grew. Whole towns were built in secret. In the hills of Tennessee, Oak Ridge appeared almost overnight. Thousands of workers, many of them young men and women, moved there. They were given small houses, cafeterias, schools, and jobs, but they were told almost nothing about what they were doing. They turned valves, checked gauges, ran machines day and night. If they asked questions, the answers were vague. This will help win the war. Only later would they learn they had been separating uranium for the first atomic bomb. Far away in Washington state, another secret city rose from the desert, the Hanford site. There, gigantic reactors stretched along the Columbia River. Farmers who had once grown wheat and apples now watched as massive concrete buildings towered over the empty land. Inside, uranium fuel rods glowed faintly, and from them scientists pulled out a strange, silvery substance, plutonium. No one outside the fences was told. For the people who lived there, the work was simply called the project. Yet machines and fuel alone could not build a weapon. The pieces needed to be joined, shaped, and tested. For this, a new place was chosen, a high desert mesa in New Mexico called Los Alamos. It was remote, surrounded by mountains and sky. Behind barbed wire, some of the greatest minds in the world gathered there. They came from Europe and America, carrying with them families, books, and secrets. Children played in the dusty streets while their parents worked late into the night. Everyone wore badges with numbers. Everyone lived inside a mystery. Life at Los Alamos was unlike anywhere else. By day, scientists filled chalkboards with equations, arguing over neutrons and explosions. By night, they listened to music on radios, read poetry, or walked under the clear desert stars. The air was sharp and thin. The work was exhausting, but it felt historic. They knew they were creating something that had never existed before. The challenge was immense. For uranium, the design seemed simple. One piece fired into another like a bullet striking its target. The two halves would become one, and in that instant, the chain reaction would begin. But plutonium was trickier. If joined too slowly, it would fizzle, ruining the weapon. The answer was implosion, a perfect inward collapse created by a ring of carefully timed explosives. The timing had to be flawless. If one charge exploded a fraction of a second too late, the whole device would fail. It was like trying to squeeze the heart of a star with human hands. Meanwhile, in Chicago, another quiet milestone was reached. Underneath the stands of a football stadium, Enrico Fermi and his team built what looked like a pile of black bricks. It was actually the world's first nuclear reactor. On December 2, 1942, they slowly withdrew control rods, and for the first time, a chain reaction was sustained. There was no flash, no bang, only instruments ticking faster and faster. A quiet fire had been lit, a fire that would one day burn cities. By 1944, the Manhattan Project was enormous. More than 100,000 people worked in silence. Entire factories hummed without their workers knowing what they were producing. Trains ran at night, carrying materials too secret to name. Guards stood watch at every gate. Families wondered what their fathers or husbands were really doing, but no one dared to ask too many questions. The entire effort was hidden behind a curtain of secrecy. At the heart of it all was a growing unease. The scientists knew what they were making. They joked sometimes, but beneath the laughter was fear. Some wondered if they were opening a door that could never be closed. Others convinced themselves that the bomb would end the war quickly, saving lives. Everyone felt the weight of time pressing down. The battles in Europe and the Pacific dragged on, and every delay in the lab meant more soldiers dying overseas. By the beginning of 1945, the project was no longer theory. It was real, and it was almost ready. In the desert of New Mexico, a tall steel tower was being built. At its top would sit a strange metal sphere, a device wrapped in wires, explosives, and secrets. It looked dull, almost harmless, but inside was the power to rival the sun. Soon, it would be tested. Soon, the world would see a light brighter than anything it had ever known. The dawn of the atomic age was no longer a dream or a theory. It was waiting, heavy and silent, in the desert, preparing to rise. The desert of New Mexico was wide and silent, a land of mesas and long horizons. On one of those mesas stood a town that did not appear on maps, Los Alamos. Behind the fences and guard towers, in wooden houses and simple labs, the most brilliant minds of the century lived and worked together. They were far from the cities they once knew, but their thoughts stretched across oceans. Each of them carried a strange knowledge. They were building something that could end the war. Or perhaps end much more than that. Life at Los Alamos was both ordinary and extraordinary. Children played in the dusty yards, chasing each other under the bright sky. Families cooked meals in tiny kitchens. Neighbors gathered for music nights or lectures. To an outsider, it might have looked like a small, isolated college town. But behind every door were calculations, diagrams, and secret experiments. Men and women who once taught in universities or built laboratory equipment were now designing a weapon that would make history tremble. The work was intense. Each day began early and the hours stretched deep into the night. Some scientists looked exhausted, others excited, some quietly afraid. They argued over blackboards filled with numbers, trying to tame the invisible forces of nature. The uranium bomb seemed possible with a simple gun design. One piece of uranium fired into another until they became one. But plutonium, the element created in Hanford, was far less cooperative. It gave off stray neutrons too quickly. If used in the gun method, it would fizzle before it truly exploded. That meant the scientists had to invent something new. The answer was implosion. Imagine a metal sphere surrounded by explosives. If those explosives all went off at exactly the same time, they would crush the sphere inward, squeezing it tighter and tighter in a fraction of a second. If done perfectly, the plutonium inside would ignite into a chain reaction. But if even one charge exploded a fraction of a heartbeat too late, the whole design would fail. It was a terrifying problem. To succeed, they had to master timing to a millionth of a second. Day after day, Los Alamos tested small explosions. In the desert sands, charges were placed in circles, set off, and filmed at high speed. The shock waves were studied like ripples in water. Scientists polished metal spheres until they shone like mirrors, measuring every curve, every layer. They invented explosive lenses to bend the shock waves, shaping fire into a perfect collapsing sphere. It was science turned into art, but art with deadly purpose. All the while, secrecy weighed heavily. Workers could not tell their families what they were doing, letters were censored, conversations were monitored. Everyone lived in fragments of the truth. A machinist might know only that he was shaping metal to a strange specification. A chemist might know only that she was purifying an unusual substance. Only a handful saw the full picture. And those who did sometimes woke at night, unable to sleep, wondering what they were unleashing. The personalities at Los Alamos shaped the place. At the center was J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director. Thin, intense, with sharp eyes, he spoke in a voice that was both gentle and commanding. To many, he seemed like a poet lost in physics, quoting from ancient texts even as he drove his colleagues to work faster. Some adored him, some resented him, but all respected him. He held together a community of rival geniuses, each with their own pride, doubts, and ambitions. There was General Leslie Groves, the military head of the Manhattan Project. Large, determined, and practical, he worried less about philosophy and more about schedules, budgets, and results. He had built the Pentagon in record time and now demanded the same efficiency from Los Alamos. He pushed the scientists hard, reminding them that every day mattered, that American soldiers were dying overseas while they debated equations. Together, Groves and Oppenheimer were like iron and fire. One dealt in rules and deadlines, the other in visions and persuasion. Between them, the project moved forward. By 1945, after years of sleepless nights, failures, and breakthroughs, the bomb designs were nearly ready. For uranium, the little boy bomb required no test. The physics was straightforward, grimly certain. But the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, was too complex, too uncertain. It had to be tried. No one could know if implosion would truly work until they set it off. So they prepared for a test. In the Jornada del Muerto desert, Journey of the Dead, a tall steel tower was built. At its top, the bomb was placed, heavy and round, its surface dull, its heart deadly. Scientists and soldiers set up bunkers miles away, dug into the earth. Instruments were wired to measure the blast. Cameras were positioned to capture the unimaginable. The night before the test, storms threatened. Rain and lightning swept across the desert, and many wondered if nature itself was warning them. In the control bunkers, men smoked nervously, checked equipment, and tried to distract themselves with jokes. Some wrote in their journals. Some sat in silence. A few could not hide their fear. One physicist worried that the explosion might ignite the atmosphere, burning the sky itself. Others dismissed the idea, but the thought lingered like a shadow. What if they had built not just a bomb, but the end of the world? In the early hours of July 16, 1945, the storm passed. The desert fell still. At 5:30 in the morning, the countdown began. Men pressed their faces against the earth, some with goggles, some shielding their eyes with their arms. There was a final breathless pause. And then, the desert turned to light. It was brighter than the sun, a white fireball blooming against the mountains. For a second, the night became day. Shadows of steel towers stretched long across the sand, then disappeared in the blaze. A great ball of fire rose, curling upward, forming the first mushroom cloud in history. The shockwave rolled across the desert, flattening the ground, rattling windows 100 miles away. In the silence that followed, no one spoke. They had seen something no human had ever seen before. The power of the stars had been brought down to earth. Oppenheimer later remembered words from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Others shouted with triumph, convinced the weapon would end the war. Some wept. Some stood in stunned silence. The test had worked. The implosion design was real. The bomb was ready. Across the ocean, Japan still fought on, battered but unyielding. Cities lay in ruins from firebombing, yet the government refused to surrender. American leaders now held in their hands a choice no one had ever faced before. They had built the most powerful weapon in history. Soon, they would decide how to use it. The dawn of the atomic age had arrived, and with it came the question that would never be answered fully. Had humanity created its salvation or its curse? By the summer of 1945, the war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead, Berlin lay in ruins, and Nazi Germany had surrendered. But across the Pacific, Japan still fought on. Though the empire had shrunk, though its navy was shattered, and its skies controlled by American planes, Japan refused to lay down its arms. The war, which had begun with surprise attacks and rapid conquests, had become a desperate struggle for survival. Japan in 1945 was a nation on the edge of exhaustion. Its cities had been bombed into ashes. Tokyo, once a vast and modern capital, had been set on fire in a single night of American bombing. Wooden houses burned like paper. Entire neighborhoods disappeared in flames. More than 80,000 people died in just a few hours. Other cities followed: Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, until hardly a major city was untouched. The glow of burning wood and bodies lit the skies night after night. But the military government clung to the dream of resistance. Soldiers still fought on distant islands, even when defeat was certain. Young pilots volunteered to become kamikaze, divine wind, strapping themselves into planes and flying straight into enemy ships. They called it honor. They called it sacrifice. To the outside world, it looked like madness. But inside Japan, the code of loyalty and the fear of surrender ran deep. Ordinary people suffered most. Food was scarce, rice was rationed, children went hungry, and farmers struggled to feed both the army and the cities. Bomb shelters were dug into the earth. Families huddled inside as the sirens wailed, wondering if this would be the night their homes were destroyed. Trains carried burned and wounded refugees from one smoldering city to another. For millions of Japanese, life became a daily test of endurance. The Japanese leadership, however, did not bend. The Supreme War Council, the Big Six, argued endlessly. Some wanted to fight until the last man, hoping to inflict such losses on the Americans that they would offer better peace terms. Others feared the Soviet Union, whose armies were massing on the borders of Manchuria, preparing to strike. But even those who admitted defeat was near could not bear the thought of unconditional surrender. To them, it meant humiliation, the end of the emperor's divine authority, and the collapse of everything they believed Japan stood for. Across the ocean, American leaders watched these developments with frustration and dread. President Franklin Roosevelt had died in April, leaving Harry Truman, a man new to the highest office, to finish the war. Truman had been vice president for only a few weeks before Roosevelt's death. He knew almost nothing of the Manhattan Project until he took the oath of office. Then, suddenly, he was told the United States was about to possess a weapon unlike anything the world had ever known. Truman carried this knowledge as reports from the Pacific crossed his desk. The Battle of Okinawa had just ended, costing more than 200,000 lives, soldiers and civilians alike. It was a glimpse of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands might look like. The numbers terrified American planners. Estimates varied, but all were grim. Hundreds of thousands of American soldiers might die. Millions of Japanese civilians might perish, and still, Japan might resist to the bitter end. The Allied leaders, meeting at conferences, faced a terrible dilemma. How could they end the war quickly without sacrificing countless more lives? They already commanded overwhelming power. American bombers flew freely over Japan. The Navy blockaded its ports. Factories lay in ruins. And yet the Japanese government did not surrender. Each week of delay meant more dead, more ruined cities, more families grieving. At the same time, the Soviet Union loomed as both ally and threat. Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan 3 months after Germany's defeat. The clock was ticking. If the Soviets invaded Japan's northern territories, they would claim land and influence in Asia. American leaders feared the post-war world as much as the war itself. They wanted Japan to surrender before Soviet troops arrived. The race to end the conflict was also a race to shape the peace that followed. In this tense atmosphere, the bomb became more than a weapon. It became a possible solution. If dropped on a city, its power might shock Japan into surrender. It might save the lives that would be lost in invasion. It might end the war in a single stroke. These were the arguments that began to circulate in Washington and among military planners. But the bomb was not only a military tool, it was also a moral question, and one that weighed heavily. Could they really unleash such destruction on civilians? Could they use a weapon that no one fully understood, a weapon that could kill not only by blast and fire, but by an invisible poison of radiation? Some argued that the bomb should first be demonstrated on an uninhabited island as a warning. Others feared that if the demonstration failed, Japan would not be impressed. Still others believed that only the shock of real destruction would force surrender. For now, the debates were only beginning. But the decision was approaching fast. The scientists had tested their creation in the desert, and it had worked. The blast had lit the mountains of New Mexico with a second sun. There was no doubt anymore. The bomb was real. The only question was how it would be used. Back in Japan, people woke each day under gray skies, uncertain if they would live to see another night. Families patched their homes with scraps of wood. Farmers planted rice in fields that had been bombed. Schoolchildren drilled in evacuation routines, carrying bamboo spears for defense, as if bamboo could stop tanks. The emperor's voice still echoed in radio speeches, calling for sacrifice, calling for faith. But beneath the surface, even the most loyal citizens began to wonder how much longer the nation could endure. The world stood on the edge of the abyss. The United States had built a weapon that could burn a city to ashes in an instant. Japan refused to surrender even as its people starved and its cities crumbled. And in the middle of it all, leaders on both sides wrestled with choices that would decide the fate of millions. No one could yet know that, within weeks, 2 cities would vanish in light and fire. No one could yet imagine the shadows that would be burned into walls or the silence that would follow after. But the moment was coming. The dawn of the atomic age was about to break over Japan. While Japan fought on in desperation, a very different battle was unfolding across the ocean. It was not fought with rifles or planes, but with words, arguments, and uneasy consciences. In America, the scientists who had built the bomb began to wonder if they had unleashed something too terrible to use. Many of these men and women had started their work with urgency and fear. They believed Germany was racing to build its own bomb. If Hitler had reached the secret of fission first, nothing could have stopped him. That fear had driven them into the deserts of New Mexico, into the reactors of Hanford, into the endless nights of equations. But by 1945, Germany was defeated. The Nazi project had failed. The danger that had haunted them was gone. Now the weapon they had created existed only in American hands. And so the question arose: what now? In June 1945, a group of scientists at the University of Chicago gathered to discuss the moral meaning of their work. They had been part of the Manhattan Project, but they felt that the next step belonged not to engineers or generals, but to humanity itself. They drafted what came to be known as the Frank Report, named after their leader, physicist James Frank. The report warned that using the bomb against Japanese cities without warning would forever stain America's name. It would set a precedent for future wars, making nuclear slaughter seem acceptable. Instead, they suggested, why not demonstrate the weapon? Set it off on a deserted island or an uninhabited area. Invite Japanese leaders to watch. Let them see with their own eyes the power of this new fire, and perhaps they would surrender without the need for mass civilian deaths. It was a plea not only for mercy, but for foresight. The scientists knew that once nuclear weapons were used, they could never be unknown again. The world would enter a new age, one where fear of the bomb would shape every nation's choices. But others argued differently. Edward Teller, one of the physicists, believed that demonstration would be risky. What if the bomb failed to explode in front of Japanese witnesses? What if they refused to surrender anyway? Then America would have lost the shock value and perhaps revealed technical secrets. Teller himself also looked beyond. He dreamed of even more powerful weapons, of hydrogen bombs, of the future of nuclear war. To him, the question was not whether to use the bomb, but how it would change the balance of power. In Washington, these debates reached the highest levels. President Truman listened to his advisors, weighing their words against the grim reality of the battlefield. His Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, saw the bomb as a way to end the war quickly and save countless American lives. He also feared the Soviet Union, America's uneasy ally. Stimson believed that demonstrating overwhelming force now would give the United States greater strength in the post-war world. Other military leaders echoed the same thoughts. They had seen the casualty estimates for an invasion of Japan. Hundreds of thousands of Americans might die storming the beaches of Kyushu and Honshu. Millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians might perish defending their homeland. Was it not more merciful, they asked, to end it all with one decisive blow? Yet mercy was not the only motive. In the shadows of these meetings lay the dawning Cold War. Even before Japan surrendered, the United States and the Soviet Union were beginning to distrust each other. Stalin's armies had swept across Eastern Europe and now massed on the edge of Asia. If America used the bomb, it would not only force Japan's surrender, it would also send a message to Moscow. The United States possessed a power beyond imagination. For Truman, the decision was heavy, but in the end, swift. He was a new president, untested, and he relied on his advisors. He believed the bomb would shorten the war. He believed it would save lives. He believed it would make America stronger in the world to come. And so, when asked, he gave his approval. The bombs would be used. Targets were selected with clinical precision. A committee of officers and scientists drew up lists. The cities chosen had to be large enough to demonstrate the bomb's destructive force, but not already ruined by conventional bombing. The aim was not simply military, it was psychological. The destruction had to be unmistakable. Hiroshima, an important military and industrial city, was placed at the top of the list. Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki followed. Kyoto, the ancient capital, was at first considered, but Stimson insisted it be spared. He had visited Kyoto before the war, admired its temples and beauty, and argued passionately to protect it. In the end, Kyoto was removed from the list. The scientists at Los Alamos continued to work, but many were restless. Some signed petitions urging that the bomb not be used on civilians. Others convinced themselves that they were not responsible for political choices. They had built the weapon. What leaders did with it was beyond their control. Still, the mood was uneasy. Some celebrated the coming end of the war. Others felt dread. A few admitted privately that they feared they had opened a future filled with shadows. At the same time, the project's secrecy kept much of the world in ignorance. The soldiers in Europe and the Pacific had no idea that a new weapon existed. The Japanese people, already crushed by firebombing, could not imagine that worse destruction was possible. Only a few thousand men and women in remote labs and guarded offices knew that history was about to turn. By July 1945, the moment of truth had arrived. The Trinity test had succeeded. A desert sky had been lit by a sun born from the atom. Truman traveled to Potsdam, Germany, to meet with Churchill and Stalin. There, in quiet conversations, he hinted to Stalin that America had a new and powerful weapon. Stalin, already informed by his spies, nodded calmly. But beneath the surface, the race for the future had begun. At Potsdam, the Allies issued a declaration to Japan: surrender unconditionally or face prompt and utter destruction. The words were chosen carefully. Japan's leaders read them, but no one in Tokyo truly understood what utter destruction meant. They believed it was another threat of fire bombs, more of what they had already endured. They did not realize that something entirely new was waiting for them. In the war rooms of Washington and the deserts of New Mexico, preparations moved forward. The uranium bomb, Little Boy, was ready. The plutonium bomb, Fat Man, had proven its power. The crews were chosen, the planes prepared, the orders drafted. All that remained was the command to fly. In the last days of July, as summer heat settled over Japan, its people still rose each morning to tend fields, repair homes, and carry on in the ruins. Children went to school carrying bamboo spears, practicing to defend their homeland against an invasion that might never come. Mothers stood in ration lines praying for rice. Soldiers dug tunnels into hillsides, determined to fight to the last. The government clung to its silence, refusing surrender, unwilling to speak of peace. And above them all, unseen, unheard, the bomb waited. The scientists had warned, the generals had debated, the politicians had decided. The course was set. Within days, Hiroshima would awaken to a morning unlike any other in human history. The 6th of August, 1945, began like any other summer morning in Hiroshima. The city lay on a delta of rivers, its bridges spanning the waters, its wooden houses clustered together, its tram lines running quietly through the streets. Dawn was soft and golden, mist rose from the hills, and the sound of cicadas filled the air. Children rubbed their eyes awake. Women prepared rice breakfasts. Men walked to work in uniforms and simple clothes. To them, it was another day in wartime Japan, another day of rationing and uncertainty, another day beneath the hum of distant bombers. Few believed their city would be attacked. Hiroshima was known as a military hub. Yes, it housed the Second Army headquarters, supply depots, and training grounds. But, unlike Tokyo or Osaka, it had never been firebombed. Rumors said it was being spared for the Americans' own use after the war. Others thought perhaps the city's many shrines and its history had kept it safe. No one guessed that its very survival had made it a target. As the morning sun climbed higher, Hiroshima stirred with life. Streetcars rattled along their tracks, carrying workers and schoolgirls in their navy uniforms. Vendors opened stalls, though goods were scarce. Farmers' carts rolled in with vegetables and sweet potatoes. The riverbanks glistened with light. If one listened closely, there was the faint drone of aircraft far above, but this sound was common and caused little alarm. Far away, on the island of Tinian in the Pacific, another scene was unfolding. Before dawn, ground crews swarmed around a giant silver plane, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay. Inside its bomb bay was a weapon no one had ever dropped in war before. It was called Little Boy, a long cylinder of steel filled with uranium-235. It weighed more than 4 tons. Its power was beyond comprehension. The crew was young. Colonel Paul Tibbets, the pilot, was only 29. The men carried out their pre-flight checks, their hearts steady, their faces calm. They had trained for this moment, but none of them fully knew what the result would be. They were told it would be decisive. They were told it might end the war. Some believed it. Some pushed down their doubts. Orders were orders. At 2:45 in the morning, Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian, its 4 engines roaring into the night sky. It carried with it not just a bomb, but a decision made in faraway offices. Truman's approval, the planner's calculations, the scientists' work of years. The plane climbed into the dark and began its long flight toward Japan. Back in Hiroshima, the day grew warmer. Workers hurried to offices, soldiers to barracks. Mothers washed clothes in the river, their children playing nearby. In schools, students gathered, some of them mobilized for labor, sent to tear down wooden houses to prevent fires from spreading if bombs ever came. Teachers organized them, unaware of what was already on the way. At 7:09 a.m., air raid sirens wailed. A small group of American weather planes had passed overhead. The alarm soon lifted, and people returned to their routines. They had grown used to false alarms. The sky looked peaceful, the air clear. By 8 a.m., Enola Gay was over Shikoku, turning toward its target. The bomb-arming crew, led by Captain William Parsons, carefully inserted the detonators. The bomb was now live. Tibbets guided the plane toward Hiroshima, steady and calm. In the distance, the city lay spread out, its rivers glinting like threads of silver. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. Little Boy fell silently, tumbling through the air for 43 long seconds. Below, the people of Hiroshima went about their lives unaware. A doctor bent over a patient. A child chased a dragonfly. A tram rolled across a bridge. Then, light. A flash brighter than the sun itself, a ball of fire hotter than the core of a furnace. In an instant, day turned into a white blindness. For those close to the hypocenter, there was no time to scream, no time to run. Shadows were burned into walls. Bodies vanished, leaving outlines on stone steps. Skin peeled like paper. Wooden houses ignited as though soaked in oil. The shockwave followed, a great wind that roared through the city at more than 1,000 kilometers an hour. Buildings crumbled, bridges snapped, streetcars were thrown off their rails, windows exploded into shards. People were hurled across streets like dolls. The city center, in seconds, was flattened. And then came fire. The blast had ignited thousands of small flames which joined into a storm. Streets became rivers of fire. Those who survived the initial explosion staggered through smoke, their clothes in rags, their skin hanging in strips. Mothers carried babies who no longer moved. People begged for water, their voices hoarse, their faces burned red and black. The rivers filled with bodies as survivors leapt in, desperate to cool their burns. Many drowned, too weak to climb out again. Above it all, the mushroom cloud climbed into the sky, a column of smoke and flame twisting upward, reaching more than 10 kilometers high. From Enola Gay, the crew turned their heads to look. They saw a boiling cloud, a city vanishing beneath it. Some gasped, some were silent. One man whispered, "My God, what have we done?" On the ground, Hiroshima was no longer a city. Within seconds, more than 70,000 people had died. Tens of thousands more lay dying in the ruins, burned, crushed, poisoned by the invisible radiation that spread outward from the blast. Hospitals collapsed with their patients still inside. Priests, teachers, soldiers, children. No one was spared. The morning that had begun so peacefully was gone. The cicadas were silent. The sky was filled with smoke. The streets, once alive with footsteps and voices, were now filled with silence broken only by cries of pain. Hiroshima, in less than 1 minute, had become a memory of itself. The flash was gone in a second, but its mark was carved into Hiroshima forever. The city that had lived and breathed that morning was now broken. From the center of the explosion outward, devastation spread in every direction. Those closest to the blast were simply erased, vaporized, their shadows seared onto walls and steps. A little farther out, people staggered through smoke, their skin hanging loose, their eyes swollen shut. They did not scream. Many could not. They simply moved, dazed, like ghosts walking through fire. In the minutes after the explosion, Hiroshima was a world of silence broken only by cries for water. Survivors crawled toward the rivers, their lips cracked and dry, their throats burned. They plunged into the water only to die there, their bodies floating together in clusters. Mothers clutched their children, some already lifeless. Soldiers stumbled through rubble, unable to find their units. Teachers called for their students, but the classrooms had vanished. One young girl remembered standing near a window when the light hit. She felt her body lifted into the air, then thrown across the room. When she woke, her hair was gone, her skin blistered. Around her, her friends lay still, their clothes in flames. She wandered outside and saw the city burning. Everything was red, she later said. The people, the houses, the sky. Another survivor recalled a man walking naked down the street, his body burned black, his arms stretched forward. He did not speak. He simply walked, step after step, until he collapsed. Children with faces swollen beyond recognition searched for their parents. Dogs howled among the ruins, then went silent. The air itself felt poisoned, heavy with dust and ash. In the hospitals that remained, chaos reigned. Doctors and nurses who had survived worked frantically, but there were no medicines, no bandages, no clean water. Thousands poured in, their wounds beyond healing. Some begged to be killed to end their pain. Priests carried the dying in their arms, whispering prayers over them as flames consumed the churches. The living were too few to bury the dead. Radiation, still little understood, spread its invisible hand. Survivors who seemed unhurt soon fell ill, bleeding from gums, vomiting, their hair falling out. Children who had escaped with only scratches died days later, their bodies giving way to a sickness no one could name. Even those who tried to help others found themselves weak, fevered, unable to stand. By midday, Hiroshima was a sea of fire and smoke. Pilots from Enola Gay, circling miles above, saw nothing but a giant cloud, boiling upward in strange colors. Beneath it, the city had become ashes. When the plane returned to Tinian, its crew reported success. The bomb had worked exactly as intended. Messages flashed across military channels. In Washington, officials received the coded report with grim satisfaction. The experiment was over. The weapon was real. But in Tokyo, confusion spread. The government received only fragments of news. At first, it was thought that a massive new kind of bomb had struck. The reports spoke of one plane, one bomb, one city destroyed. Yet no one could believe it fully. The Japanese military had prepared for firebombing, for invasion, but not for this. Not for a single weapon that could erase an entire city in a single instant. The day wore on, and more survivors tried to flee. Those who could still walk moved out of the burning ruins carrying what little they had left, but the wounded filled the streets. Some lay in rows, silent. Others moaned softly, too weak to rise. Families searched desperately among the bodies, calling names. The smell of smoke, burned wood, and burned flesh filled the air. The rivers turned black with ash and blood. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Hiroshima glowed not with life, but with fire. Clouds of dust drifted upward, lit by the orange flames. Those who survived curled on the ground, too weak to move, whispering prayers into the night. For many, sleep never came again. In the days that followed, the true scale of the disaster became clear. Hiroshima had held around 350,000 people on the morning of August 6th. By nightfall, tens of thousands were dead. Within weeks, more than 100,000 would be gone. Survivors, later called hibakusha, bomb-affected people, carried scars both visible and hidden. Some bore burns across their faces and arms. Others carried illnesses that returned again and again, the silent work of radiation inside their blood. The Japanese government struggled to respond. Information was censored, but the truth spread in whispers. Entire districts had vanished. The Second Army headquarters, hospitals, schools, all destroyed. Hiroshima was no longer a functioning city. It was rubble, corpses, and silence. Meanwhile, in Washington, the mood was both triumphant and cold. President Truman announced to the world that a new weapon had been used. He warned Japan that if they did not surrender, more destruction would follow. To him, it was the beginning of the end of the war. To the scientist who had built the bomb, it was both victory and nightmare. Some rejoiced, believing they had saved lives by forcing Japan to surrender quickly. Others were horrified, realizing the scale of suffering their creation had unleashed. Back in Hiroshima, the survivors endured each day as best they could. Without food or medicine, they relied on wells, on scraps, on each other. Some wandered the ruins, searching for family who would never return. Priests held funerals for dozens at once. The stench of death lingered everywhere. It was as if hell had come to earth, one man said, and still, Japan did not surrender, Even with Hiroshima destroyed, the government hesitated. The War Council argued as before. Some demanded to fight on, others urged peace. The emperor remained silent, watching and waiting. They did not yet know that another bomb was already being prepared, aimed at another city. For the people of Hiroshima, the morning of August 6th had lasted only a moment, but its echo would last forever. Shadows burned into walls, voices crying for water. A city turned to ash. The first use of the atomic bomb had written itself into human memory. And though the fires would fade, the questions it raised would never disappear. 3 days had passed since Hiroshima burned. In that short time, the world had changed forever, though few yet understood how deeply. News traveled slowly through Japan. Many people in other cities did not know what had happened, or did not believe the rumors. A single bomb destroying an entire city? It sounded impossible, like a story whispered to frightened children, but in Hiroshima, the blackened ruins told the truth. And in the skies above the Pacific, another bomb was already on its way. The second target was not supposed to be Nagasaki. The city marked first on the list was Kokura, an industrial hub with weapons factories. On the morning of August 9th, a B-29 bomber named Boxcar rose from the island of Tinian, carrying the second atomic weapon. This bomb was different from the first. Hiroshima had been destroyed by a device nicknamed Little Boy, powered by uranium. The new bomb, called Fat Man, used plutonium, a deadlier and more complicated design. It was heavier, bulkier, and more powerful. Scientists had tested a weapon of this type in the desert of New Mexico only weeks earlier, in the blast they called Trinity. That fireball had lit up the sands brighter than the sun. Now, another of its kind was aimed at Japan. The crew of Boxcar faced a tense journey. Their mission was clear. If Kokura was visible, they would drop the bomb there. If not, they would move to the secondary target, Nagasaki. The men in the bomber knew they carried the most destructive force ever built by human hands. Inside the aircraft, the bomb lay secured, its mechanisms armed, waiting. One mistake, one accident could have meant disaster, even for them. As the plane neared Kokura, the crew looked down through their instruments. Clouds covered the city. Smoke from previous fire bombings drifted across the sky. The bombardier could not see his target clearly. The mission required a visual drop. Again and again they circled, but the city remained hidden under the haze. Each pass burned precious fuel. Time was slipping away. Finally, with tanks running low, the commander made the decision. Kokura was spared. The plane turned south, toward Nagasaki. By a twist of fate, one city lived while another would die. Survivors would later call it the luck of Kokura. Nagasaki was not the same kind of target. Unlike Hiroshima, which lay on a flat plain, Nagasaki was a city of hills and valleys. It was an important port with shipyards and munitions factories, but also a city of neighborhoods, schools, and churches. On that morning, life continued as always. Workers walked to their jobs, women shopped in the markets, children played in the streets. No one imagined that within hours, the sky above them would explode. When Boxcar reached Nagasaki, the weather again threatened to block the mission. Thick clouds spread over the valley. At first, the bombardier could see nothing. They prepared to return to base with the bomb still aboard, but at the last moment, a break opened in the clouds. The bombardier locked onto the Urakami Valley, home to homes, schools, and the grand Urakami Cathedral, the largest Christian church in East Asia. The order was given. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb fell. What followed was fire. A blinding flash filled the sky. The hills and rivers of Nagasaki lit up as if the sun had fallen to earth. In the next instant, the city was smashed by a wave of heat and wind more powerful than any storm. Buildings vanished. Roof tiles melted. Human beings turned to ash where they stood. The cathedral, filled with worshippers at morning mass, collapsed in an instant, its stone walls crumbling, its bells silenced forever. Those near the center of the blast were erased in moments. Others staggered through the ruins, their bodies burned, their skin hanging. A mother carrying her baby found herself standing alone, her child gone in the flash. Survivors stumbled into the rivers, desperate to cool their burning flesh, only to die in the water. The bomb's fire consumed wood, stone, and flesh alike. Unlike Hiroshima, where destruction spread across a flat plain, Nagasaki's hills contained the blast. The bomb's fury was focused into a deep valley, magnifying its power there, while sparing some districts beyond the ridges. Yet this was little comfort to the tens of thousands who lay dead or dying. In the hours that followed, the city was a vision of nightmare. Columns of smoke rose into the sky. Fires raged uncontrolled. Survivors, blinded, burned, and bleeding, wandered aimlessly. The rivers filled with bodies. The once proud cathedral was nothing but ruins and rubble, a twisted cross rising out of the ashes. The boxcar crew turned for home, their fuel nearly gone. They had dropped the second atomic bomb in history. Behind them lay a city broken forever. Reports would soon spread of the devastation, though like Hiroshima, much of the horror was beyond words. By nightfall, Nagasaki was silent, except for the crackle of fire and the cries of the wounded. Families searched for loved ones who would never return. The dead lay in rows, too many to count. Doctors, already overwhelmed, struggled to treat those still alive, but there was little they could do. No medicine could heal wounds made by fire so intense. The numbers were staggering. Of the city's population of about 240,000, at least 40,000 were killed instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the following days and weeks from burns, injuries, and radiation sickness. In both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, entire families had vanished. Generations wiped away in a moment. The survivors, the hibakusha, carried their scars forward. Some bore burns shaped like the clothes they had worn, patterns forever etched into their skin. Others suffered invisible sicknesses that returned again and again, their bodies weakened by the radiation. Children were born with illnesses, mothers lost their strength, and the shadow of the bomb followed them through life. In Tokyo, the news of Nagasaki struck like thunder. 2 cities destroyed in less than a week. The government was shaken. Some leaders still urged resistance, but others began to see that Japan could not withstand this new weapon. Emperor Hirohito, silent for so long, began to consider surrender. For the first time, his voice would soon be heard in deciding the fate of the nation. Far away in Washington, officials spoke of the bomb with a mix of triumph and calculation. The war, they believed, would end sooner now. But even they did not yet know what they had unleashed, not only in Japan, but in the world itself. For Nagasaki was not only the end of a city, it was the opening of an age of fear, fire, and the shadow of nuclear death. The fires of Nagasaki smoldered for days. Smoke drifted across the valleys, carrying the stench of burning wood, stone, and flesh. The sky above was a dull gray, as if the heavens themselves mourned. In the ruins, silence was broken only by the cries of the wounded and the sound of footsteps among the rubble. People searched for family members who would never return. Mothers called out for children who had vanished into dust. Fathers lifted stones with bleeding hands, hoping for a miracle. Those who survived the first day soon faced another kind of enemy: thirst. Water was scarce. Rivers were filled with bodies, and those who drank often collapsed moments later, poisoned by radiation. Wounded people stretched out their arms, begging for a drop of water. Soldiers and volunteers tried to help, but the destruction was overwhelming. Hospitals had been destroyed. Doctors were few, nurses exhausted. Medicine was gone. Bandages were torn from the clothes of the dead. Everything smelled of smoke, blood, and despair. Radiation, invisible and merciless, seeped into bodies. Survivors who looked unharmed fell sick days later. They vomited. Their hair fell out. Purple spots covered their skin. Children whimpered with fevers no one could explain. Parents held them, powerless, watching as life drained away. This new sickness frightened even the doctors, who did not understand it. Some whispered that the city itself had been poisoned. Others believed a strange new plague had been unleashed. The Urakami Valley, where the bomb had fallen, was unrecognizable. Once a busy district of homes and factories, it had become a crater of ash. The grand cathedral that had stood for nearly a century was now a skeleton of stone. Priests lay among the rubble, their prayers silenced in an instant. Survivors who stumbled into the valley felt as if they had entered another world, one where all signs of human life had been erased. Among the ruins, stories of survival glimmered like faint lights in the darkness. A boy pulled his younger sister from beneath a collapsed house. A woman shielded a child with her body, saving the child, though she herself died of burns. A group of workers found shelter in a tunnel and emerged to see their city gone. These small acts of courage did not erase the tragedy, but they showed that even in the face of annihilation, humanity endured. As news of Nagasaki reached Tokyo, confusion and fear spread through the government. Only 3 days earlier, Hiroshima had been destroyed. At first, some leaders doubted the reports, thinking the enemy exaggerated. But now, with Nagasaki in ruins, there was no doubt. 2 cities had been wiped from the map, not by hundreds of bombers, but by single weapons. Japan's leaders argued fiercely. The military demanded resistance. Some generals spoke of arming civilians with bamboo spears, urging them to fight to the last. They dreamed of a final desperate battle on the homeland, but others understood the truth. If Japan refused to surrender, more cities could vanish. Emperor Hirohito, who had watched silently for years, now faced a choice. For the first time, he listened directly to the suffering of his people. Reports described Hiroshima and Nagasaki as places where shadows were burned into the walls, where the living envied the dead. The emperor realized that continuing the war meant the destruction of Japan itself. He told his ministers that the nation must endure the unendurable and accept surrender. In Nagasaki, survivors still clung to life while leaders debated. Families dug shallow graves, burying loved ones quickly to prevent disease. Funeral pyres burned day and night, filling the air with smoke that mixed with the smell of death. People carried their dead on carts, some too weak to walk, collapsing beside the bodies of children or parents. American planes dropped leaflets warning of more bombs if Japan did not yield. Many in Nagasaki, already broken, believed them. They imagined every city in Japan glowing with fire. They whispered that the world itself was ending. On August 15th, less than a week after the second bomb, the emperor's voice was broadcast across the nation. For most Japanese, it was the first time they had ever heard him. His words were formal, distant, but clear enough. Japan would surrender. The war was over. For some, relief washed over them like cool rain. For others, it felt like defeat, worse than death. Soldiers wept, children clung to mothers, and old men stared silently at the ground. But in Nagasaki, the suffering did not end with surrender. Radiation lingered. Survivors carried burns that would scar them for life. Some never healed. Others seemed fine for months, only to sicken later. Women gave birth to children with strange illnesses. Survivors, called hibakusha, faced not only pain but also shame. Many people feared them, believing they carried a sickness that could spread. Jobs were denied, marriages refused. Their scars marked them as outcasts in their own land. And yet, the hibakusha endured. They told their stories, slowly, often with tears, to make sure the world would remember. They described the sky on that day, the fire, the silence afterward. They spoke of the children who disappeared, the families erased, the city that turned to ash. They carried not only their wounds, but also the memory of those who could no longer speak. Nagasaki had been chosen almost by chance. If the clouds had not parted, the bomb might have fallen elsewhere, but chance sealed its fate. And in that fate, the world learned what 2 atomic bombs could do. Hiroshima had shocked the world. Nagasaki confirmed it. In the aftermath, generals spoke of victory and politicians spoke of peace. But in the ruins of Nagasaki, people asked another question. What had humanity unleashed? They looked at the sky with fear, wondering if more suns would fall from above. The war was over, but a new age had begun, an age where every nation lived under the shadow of atomic fire. When the smoke cleared and the fires of war faded, the world stepped into a silence it had never known before. Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in ruins, but from their ashes rose something far greater than destroyed cities. They became symbols. They were not just Japanese cities anymore. They were warnings written in fire. The survivors, hibakusha as they came to be called, carried the weight of that warning on their scarred shoulders. These were men, women, and children who had looked into the heart of destruction and somehow walked away. But they did not walk away untouched. Their bodies, their memories, and their lives were forever marked. In the first months after the bombs, Japan struggled simply to survive. Millions had lost homes in firebombings even before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Food was scarce, cities were flattened, families wandered roads, hungry and homeless. And yet, in the middle of this national suffering, the Hibakusha lived with wounds that made them different. Their burns drew stares. Their illnesses frightened neighbors. Many whispered that they carried a curse, as if the fire of the bomb still burned inside them. At hospitals set up by the few surviving doctors, patients lay in crowded halls. Children whimpered, their heads shaved after hair fell out in clumps. Mothers wept over babies who would not stop bleeding from the nose. No one understood radiation then. To many, it was a ghostly sickness, invisible and merciless. A doctor might treat a burn, but then days later watch the same patient collapse with fever and die. Nurses whispered prayers as they cleaned wounds, knowing prayer was often all they had left. In the years that followed, life slowly rebuilt itself. New houses rose where ruins had been. Schools opened, markets returned, and trains ran again. But for the Hibakusha, rebuilding was never complete. They carried the war inside them. Many were rejected by employers who feared they would die young. Women found it hard to marry. Families worried that children born from Hibakusha would be weak or sick. Survivors spoke quietly, if at all, about what had happened. Some chose silence, hoping to protect loved ones from the heavy burden of their memories. Yet silence could not erase the truth. From time to time, the memories broke through. A woman walking past a river would suddenly recall the bodies floating in it on August 6th or August 9th. A man working in a factory would see the flash of welding sparks and remember the blinding white light that swallowed his city. Children would wake from nightmares of fire, even if they had been too young to remember the bombs themselves. Trauma flowed like a hidden river beneath the surface of daily life. And still, out of that trauma, voices began to rise. Survivors started to tell their stories. At first, it was only to family, then to neighbors, then in small gatherings. Later, their words spread to the world. They spoke of the burning sky, of people whose shadows were burned onto walls, of friends who turned to ash in their hands. These testimonies became the living memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Hibakusha, many of them poor and weak, became witnesses not only for Japan, but for all humanity. Their words carried a message. Never again. Some described themselves not as victims, but as messengers sent to warn the future. They knew that what had happened to them could happen again, only worse. For if 2 bombs could erase 2 cities, what could thousands of bombs now being built in America, the Soviet Union, Britain, and later others, do to the entire Earth? Outside Japan, the world looked at Hiroshima and Nagasaki with both shock and calculation. Scientists spoke of a new age of warfare. Politicians spoke of strategy and power. Generals studied the ruins as if they were blueprints. But the Hibakusha spoke of children's cries, of skin hanging from arms, of thirst that could never be quenched. Between these 2 ways of speaking, the cold language of power and the raw voice of suffering, lay the heart of the new atomic age. In the ruins, priests prayed over mass graves. Poets wrote of shadows that outlived the bodies that cast them. Artists painted skies filled with fire. Survivors who could not afford art or poetry simply remembered. And their remembering was its own kind of creation, a painful but necessary gift to the future. The first memorial ceremonies were small, quiet affairs. People lit lanterns and floated them on rivers, watching the lights drift into darkness. Each lantern was a soul, a memory, a plea. Later, the ceremonies grew. By the 1950s, thousands gathered at Hiroshima's Peace Park. Names of the dead were inscribed on stones. The eternal flame was lit to burn until the last nuclear weapon was gone. In Nagasaki, bells rang at the exact moment of the explosion each year, their sound rising above the rebuilt city. Children of survivors also carried the story. Some grew up sick. struggling with mysterious illnesses. Others grew up healthy but carried the pain of watching parents fade too soon. Many Hibakusha families lived with a kind of double weight, the memory of the past and the fear of the future, and yet even with this weight, they taught their children to speak of peace. The memory of the atomic fire became not just a Japanese memory, but a global one. Visitors from around the world came to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Some came as tourists, some came as mourners, some came as leaders, standing in silence before the cenotaphs, realizing the decisions of men in offices could wipe out entire peoples. The Hibakusha met them with quiet dignity, their scars visible, their voices steady. And so, Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not stay only in the past. They became living warnings told by those who walked through hell and returned. They showed the cost of war not in numbers or speeches, but in human faces and broken bodies. The survivors could not change what had happened, but by speaking, by remembering, they hoped to change what might happen. Their legacy was not only pain, it was also a gift, a reminder that the world stood at a threshold, one path leading to life, the other to fire. The bombs had ended the Second World War, but they had also opened a door that could never again be closed. Humanity had stepped into a new era, one where a single decision could erase a city, a nation, or even life itself. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just tragedies. They were the first warning signs of the age of fear. In the years that followed 1945, the world's great powers did not turn away from this weapon. Instead, they raced to build more. The United States, no longer the only owner of the atomic secret, tested bigger and deadlier devices. In deserts and on distant islands, the sky lit up again and again with artificial suns. The Soviet Union, determined not to fall behind, exploded its own bomb in 1949. Soon, Britain, France, and China joined the nuclear club. Each nation claimed it was for defense, for protection, for peace. But behind every test, every mushroom cloud, there was a simple truth. The world was stockpiling the power to destroy itself. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols, but they also became questions. Did the bombs truly end the war, or did they begin a new endless one? For while Japan surrendered, the world entered the Cold War, a conflict fought not only with armies, but with shadows of nuclear fire hanging over every decision. Ordinary people felt this fear even if they could not see it. Children in America and Europe practiced hiding under school desks as if a wooden desk could shield them from a sun made by man. In Soviet cities, citizens drilled for the unthinkable, imagining missiles falling from the sky. Posters showed families building backyard shelters. Radios carried warnings. For the first time in history, entire nations lived with the thought that tomorrow could bring not victory or defeat, but the end of all things. And always, when leaders spoke of strength, when generals spoke of deterrence, the images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki rose in the background. The shadows on walls, the melted stone, the people walking like ghosts through burning streets. Those two cities were no longer only Japanese. They were the world's reminder of what nuclear war meant. Philosophers, writers, and even scientists who had built the bomb began to ask, what have we done? J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific father of the atomic age, stood before the American government and remembered the words of an ancient Hindu text. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He knew, as others knew, that the power created in New Mexico in 1945 was not just a weapon. It was a mirror held up to humanity's own nature, its brilliance, its ambition, and its capacity for destruction. Some argued the bomb had saved lives by ending the war quickly. Others said Japan was already near surrender, and the bombs were meant to send a message to the Soviet Union more than to defeat Japan. This debate has never ended, but whether one believes the bombs were necessary or not, the fact remains. The world saw what they could do, and from that moment, the threat of nuclear fire became part of human history. The Hibakusha, the survivors, carried this debate not in books, but in their own bodies. When they spoke in the years after the war, they did not speak of politics or strategy. They spoke of children turned to ash, of thirst so strong people drank water from rivers filled with corpses, of wounds that never healed. Their testimony cut through the calculations of statesmen. They reminded the world that behind every theory of deterrence lay real human lives. As the Cold War deepened, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became rallying cries for peace movements across the globe. In the 1960s and 70s, protesters marched with signs reading, "No more Hiroshimas." Students, priests, mothers, and veterans gathered outside bases and embassies, demanding an end to nuclear testing and disarmament. Some leaders listened. Treaties were signed to limit the spread of weapons. But the weapons themselves never disappeared. They multiplied, hidden in silos and submarines, waiting in silence. In Japan, the memory of the bombs became a national mission. Hiroshima and Nagasaki built peace museums and parks, places where visitors could see twisted steel, burned clothing, and the stories of those who suffered. School children grew up learning not only about the war, but about the meaning of nuclear fire. Survivors spoke in classrooms, their voices trembling but steady, urging children to remember what their elders had endured. Still, as decades passed, a new fear grew. Survivors aged, their numbers dwindled. Soon there would be no living witnesses left. Who would remember when the last hibakusha was gone? This question hung heavy in Japan and beyond. For memories fade, and humanity is quick to forget even its greatest tragedies. Yet forgetting, survivors warned, is the first step toward repeating. In art, film, and literature, Hiroshima and Nagasaki lived on. Writers described skies filled with ash. Poets wrote of silent shadows. Directors made films that showed the human side of the atomic blast. Not numbers or strategy, but faces, voices, families torn apart in an instant. These works carried the memory forward, even for people born long after 1945. And still, the philosophical question remained. Were Hiroshima and Nagasaki the end of the world? Nagasaki the end of a war? Or the beginning of a darker age? Some called August 1945 the moment the 20th century truly began, for it showed what science, politics, and war together could unleash. Others said it was the beginning of the end, proof that human hands had reached too far, too fast. The legacy of the atomic fire is not only about the past, it is also about choice. Every generation since 1945 has lived with that choice, to use this power for destruction or to restrain it, to let Hiroshima and Nagasaki be the first and last, or to let them become the prologue to something far worse. The survivors gave the world their answer. They said, "Remember, choose peace. Do not repeat our suffering." Their voices, fragile yet enduring, became a compass. Whether the world will follow it remains uncertain. But the message is there, carried in the scars of those who lived through the end of the world. The atomic bombs ended one war, but they also began an age defined by fear, hope, memory, and warning. They left behind not only ruins, but questions that remain alive today. What does it mean to have the power to destroy all life? What does it mean to build peace in the shadow of such power? These are not questions only for Japan or only for the past. They are questions for all humanity, for as long as the bombs remain. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not the end of the world, but they showed us how the world could end. And in that knowledge lies both our danger and our responsibility.